The neon glow of the Safeway supermarket lights still burned bright in Maple Falls, Washington. When Emily Carter vanished into the mist of an October night in 2004, the small town of just over 7,000 people was blanketed in cold autumn rain. Emily was only 20 years old, driving a silver Toyota Corolla along a familiar 12-minute route home. She never arrived. 2 days later, her wallet and cell phone appeared neatly placed beneath a maple tree at the edge of the Safeway parking lot. There was no sign of robbery. Witness whispers soon spoke of a heated argument with a gray-haired man. Then her silhouette was gone, swallowed by darkness. For 2 decades, the Carter family and the people of Maple Falls carried that memory like an open wound. Each October, candles flickered in the park, a fragile reminder that the question of what happened to Emily still lingered. In 2023, the case was reopened, and the truth that emerged shook the community to its core. What secret did the DNA left on a forgotten cigarette reveal after 20 years of silence? And how could a trusted neighbor, once seen as kind and ordinary, become the center of the town's greatest nightmare? If you want to uncover the answers to these questions, make sure you like this video and subscribe to Unscripted Tales. Tell me in the comments from which city you are watching this cold case story. Let us complete 5,000 likes to continue sharing more hidden stories that deserve the light of truth. On October 12, 2004, Maple Falls was veiled in steady autumn rain. Its narrow roads shimmered with reflected streetlights, each puddle glinting gold. Mist clung to doorframes and drifted into open fields. At a roadside diner off the main highway, where truckers often stopped for late-night coffee, Emily Carter finished her shift at 10 o'clock. She cleared the last tables, washed the final cups, and offered her co-workers a quiet goodbye. Some noted that she seemed subdued that night, her eyes weighed down after a recent breakup. Yet she still managed a small smile before stepping into the chill and pulling a thin jacket close around her. Moments later, she slid into the driver's seat of her familiar silver Corolla. The drive was short, a route she knew better than any, but under the glow of wet pavement and drifting rain, the car slipped into the night. It never reached the Carter home. The rain kept falling steady on the small town of Maple Falls as Emily Carter stepped out of the diner. Just after 10 o'clock that October night, she pulled her thin jacket tighter, her hair damp with mist, and walked across the nearly empty lot. Her co-workers had noticed the quiet in her that evening. Emily had always been warm and talkative, but that night, her voice was softer, her gaze heavier. The recent breakup with her boyfriend seemed to hang over her like a cloud. Still, she forced a small smile as she waved goodbye and slid into the driver's seat of her silver Toyota Corolla. The familiar hum of the engine echoed in the rain as she turned onto the narrow road. She had taken this 12-minute drive hundreds of times before, a route she could follow half asleep. The streetlights reflected across the wet pavement, creating golden streaks that shimmered under her headlights. The mist swirled low across the road, wrapping the town in a fragile silence. Back at home, Susan Carter sat by the living room window, watching the empty road. Every few minutes, she glanced at the clock, waiting to hear the sound of tires on gravel, waiting for her daughter's car to appear through the drizzle. The minutes stretched longer. By 10:30, the road was still dark. Susan dialed Emily's phone. Once, twice, again and again. Each call went straight to voicemail, her voice trembling as she left messages that were never answered. By 11, the unease turned into panic. Susan tried again, her heart pounding in the silence of the house. The phone rang endlessly, each unanswered tone cutting deeper. She called relatives, she called Aaron, her son, and then, with shaking hands, she finally called the police. Her voice cracked as she described how her daughter had vanished on a drive that should have lasted no more than 12 minutes. That night, as patrol cars swept the dark roads and family members gathered in fear, Maple Falls began to sense that something terrible had happened. A quiet autumn evening had turned into a storm of uncertainty. But what the police discovered in those first hours only deepened the mystery of Emily's disappearance. The moment Susan Carter's call reached the police station, officers wasted No time to patrol cars rolled out into the rain, headlights slicing through the mist as they traced the route from the diner to the Carter home. Every bend in the road was scanned, every ditch illuminated. The officers expected at first to find skid marks, shattered glass, or the twisted frame of a car that had slid off the wet pavement. But the roads were clear. No signs of an accident, no debris, nothing to suggest a crash. It was as if Emily's car had simply vanished into the rain-soaked night. Checkpoints were quickly set up on nearby routes. Officers stood under dripping raincoats, stopping passing vehicles, asking if anyone had seen a silver Toyota Corolla between 10 and 11 o'clock. Drivers shook their heads, their wipers beating against the steady drizzle. The silence of negative answers only made the night heavier. Back at the station, investigators began questioning Emily's co-workers from the diner. They said she had been quieter that evening, more reserved than usual. One mentioned she had a small beer during her break, not enough to affect her, just enough to leave her cheeks a little flushed. The detail was written down carefully, though it did not explain why she never made it home. Speculations started to build. Could she have lost control of the wheel on the slick road? Could the rain and a tired mind have led her car into the woods? Unseen, if that was the case, then her Corolla should have been discovered within hours. Yet every sweep of the roadside came back empty. The road to her home stretched bare, the silence broken only by the patter of rain. As dawn approached, the police still had no trace of Emily or her car. For her family, the hours of waiting stretched into unbearable fear. For investigators, the lack of evidence was more unsettling than any crash site. And when word began to spread through the small town, Maple Falls woke to a mystery that would soon grow larger than anyone imagined. By the time the sun rose over Maple Falls, the town was already buzzing with fear. Susan Carter and her son Aaron moved quickly, printing flyers with Emily's bright smile and desperate words beneath her picture. Missing. Have you seen Emily Carter? Those papers were taped to telephone poles, pinned on supermarket boards, and placed in the windows of the general store. Everywhere people went, her face followed. A reminder that a young woman had vanished on a short drive home. The Maple Falls Chronicle carried the story on its front page with a chilling headline that asked, "Who saw Emily?" Neighbors read the paper. At breakfast tables, in diners, in barbershops. Whispers started almost instantly. Some said maybe she had run away. Others believed something darker had happened. Each person carried their own theory, but all of them shared the same fear. The police intensified their search. K-29 units were brought in, handlers guiding the dogs along the roadside and into the woods. The animals picked up Emily's scent, pulling eagerly across the pavement near the Safeway parking lot. They followed the trail to the western edge of the trees, barking sharply, digging at the ground. Then suddenly, the scent ended. The dogs circled, confused, their handlers tugging gently at the leashes. It was as if Emily's trail had been cut off, erased in the very place it should have grown stronger. Television crews arrived, their cameras catching the glow of patrol car lights bouncing off the wet roads. Reporters stood with umbrellas at the roadside, speaking into microphones as search teams disappeared into the woods behind them. The quiet town of Maple Falls, once only known for its fall festivals and small-town charm, was now being watched by thousands across the region. Inside kitchens, families argued over what might have happened. Some believed Emily had been taken by a stranger, others were convinced it was someone she knew. With no answers, suspicion began to spread like a cold shadow across the town. And when the police made a discovery 2 days later, the unease in Maple Falls deepened into something far more chilling. To long days passed with no trace of Emily or her silver Toyota Corolla. Search teams returned empty-handed, and the town grew heavier with dread. Then, during a routine sweep of the Safeway parking lot on the edge of Maple Falls, an officer noticed something unusual beneath a tall maple tree. Resting carefully side by side on the damp ground were Emily's brown leather wallet and her cell phone. Everything inside the wallet was untouched. Her identification, her cash, even small receipts from the diner were still there. Nothing suggested robbery. Instead, the way the items were placed seemed deliberate, as though someone had set them there for others to find. The area was quickly sealed with police tape as investigators crouched beneath the tree, photographing every angle. Attention turned to the store's security cameras. Investigators pulled the footage from the night Emily vanished. But the year was 2004. The cameras were low quality, their images grainy and distorted under the yellow glow of the parking lot lamps. On the screen, Emily could be seen stepping out of her Corolla, her slim frame and jacket faintly visible in the light. Then she moved toward the edge of the lot. After that, the darkness swallowed her completely. No one followed her. No struggle was visible, just silence. The chilling discovery deepened the mystery. Why would she abandon her most personal belongings under a tree, with not a single sign of violence? Was she lured away? Was someone waiting in the shadows beyond the cameras? Reach. And when a witness finally stepped forward with a memory from that rainy night, suspicion in Maple Falls shifted sharply toward a single unsettling detail. Not long after Emily's wallet and phone were found beneath the maple tree, a man who lived near the supermarket came forward with a memory that unsettled everyone. On the night Emily vanished, he had seen a young woman who looked very much like her in the parking lot. She was not alone. She appeared to be in a heated argument with a middle-aged man who had gray hair. The witness remembered the man's gestures, wide and forceful, while the young woman shook her head and turned away. The rain blurred his view, and the distance made it impossible to see their faces clearly. Still, the image haunted him. Police carefully recorded his statement, but it gave them little more than a shadow. A gray-haired man on a rainy night was not enough to identify anyone. Officers questioned shoppers who had visited the store, interviewed employees who had worked the late shift, and reviewed receipts from that evening. Yet no one could place a stranger in the lot. No one could confirm the man's presence beyond that single testimony. As the news spread through Maple Falls, whispers began to grow. Residents eyed men in the community who fit the description. Suspicion turned toward familiar faces, neighbors, and even acquaintances. In small groups, at the diner and after church services, people whispered names, but no one dared speak them loudly. Every gray-haired man became a potential suspect in the minds of anxious townsfolk. The narrative shifted. The town no longer imagined that Emily had simply driven off the road or vanished by chance. Now they feared someone had forced her away. A shadow in the parking lot had replaced the comfort of any accident theory, leaving behind the question of who this man was and why Emily had been with him that night. And as the search for answers grew, Maple Falls gathered its strength and prepared to hunt for Emily in numbers that the town had never seen before. The whispers about the gray-haired man spread quickly, and Maple Falls soon moved from fear to action. The police called for volunteers, and the response was overwhelming. By the next morning, cars lined up outside the high school football field, headlights shining through the mist. More than 100 people arrived, carrying flashlights, wearing boots, and ready to search for Emily. Inside a large coordination tent, officers drew maps across a whiteboard. Roads and fields were marked in red, while circles of green showed the zones where volunteers would walk. Each group was given reflective armbands and sticks to push through the underbrush. The town's residents, who usually gathered for fairs and parades, now stood side by side with solemn faces, ready to comb through every inch of the land. Search teams moved toward Cedar Avenue, pushing into the damp woods that lined the road Emily would have driven. Others headed for Maple Lake, their beams of light dancing across the rippling surface of the water. Another group traced the Stillwater River, walking slowly along its muddy banks. Calling her name into the chill air. Police dogs led their handlers back to the Safeway lot, noses pressed low against the ground. They picked up Emily's scent and pulled eagerly across the pavement toward the western edge of the woods. There, they barked furiously, digging at the soft soil as though something important was hidden just ahead. But when they were led deeper into the trees, the trail faded. The dogs circled, restless, unable to find direction. It was as if Emily's path had ended at that very spot, cut short by something no one could see. Helicopters circled above, their searchlights cutting through the canopy. From the ground, the beams looked like white swords slicing the night, but they revealed nothing except branches and shadows. Volunteers returned to the tent with false leads. Some swore they heard cries in the distance, but it was only the wind. Others thought they spotted movement in the trees, but no trace was ever found. Hour after hour, hope began to thin. Families returned home exhausted, their boots muddy, their arms heavy. Yet Susan Carter and Erin stayed at the field, clinging to the faint belief that someone, somewhere, might still bring Emily back. But as the days stretched on and every search ended with empty hands, the town began to face a darker truth. Months of searching turned into years, and by early 2006, the official investigation was suspended. Emily Carter's name was filed away under unresolved missing person. For the police, it became another stack of dry paperwork. For the Carter family, it was a wound that never healed. Inside the small Carter home, Emily's bedroom was left untouched, as though she might walk in at any moment. The pillows were still neatly arranged. A cheap bottle of perfume still sat on her desk. Posters of teen pop stars still hung on the walls, their colors fading slowly with time. The room became a frozen museum of a life paused at the age of 20. Each time Susan walked past the door, she paused, dusting the desk, straightening the covers, whispering her daughter's name as if those small rituals could somehow bring her back. The weight of waiting crushed Susan's health. Once strong and full of energy, she grew frail and tired, her eyes losing their brightness. She often sat in the armchair near the window, staring at the road where Emily's headlights should have once appeared. Neighbors who visited found her thinner, her voice softer, her hands trembling with age and sorrow that had arrived too early. For Aaron, who was only 14 when Emily vanished, the shadow of loss shaped his entire youth. He grew up in a house where every meal felt incomplete, where silence replaced laughter. At school, classmates whispered behind his back. Teachers spoke gently but quickly changed the subject. He withdrew into himself, often listening to music through headphones to block out the questions he could not answer. In his private journal, he wrote that each morning he hoped a clue would appear, and each night he went to bed with the same emptiness. Maple Falls itself slowly returned to its ordinary rhythm. The supermarket reopened to busy shoppers. The diner filled again with truckers and families. Children played in the park, but beneath the surface, the town carried a scar. Each time someone passed the Safeway lot, they remembered the wallet and phone left under the tree. Each time headlights swept across Cedar Avenue on a rainy night, someone whispered about the silver Corolla that had disappeared into the dark. The town appeared calm, but the haunting question never faded. Where had Emily Carter gone? And years later, when a single announcement reignited the case, Maple Falls would learn that even time could not bury the truth. The years passed, but Maple Falls never truly let Emily's memory slip into silence. Every October 12th, families gathered in Central Park beneath the old war memorial statue. Hundreds of candles flickered in the cool night air, their soft light glowing in the eyes of parents, children, and searchers who had once walked the woods for Emily. Some bowed their heads in prayer, others simply stood in silence, the flames reflecting on tearful faces. For 2 decades, the vigil became a ritual, a way for the town to remember a young woman who never came home. Meanwhile, Maple Falls itself changed. New supermarkets opened, the main road was widened, and a highway eventually bypassed the town. Yet no matter how modern the buildings became, the story of Emily Carter remained carved into its history. Parents reminded their children not to walk alone at night. Teachers spoke her name as a quiet warning in classrooms. To many in town, Emily became more than just a missing person. She became a symbol of how fragile safety could be. Inside the Carter family home, Susan aged under the weight of absence. Her hair turned white, her shoulders bent with time, but she never stopped opening Emily's bedroom door. She dusted the desk, straightened the pillows, and touched the old perfume bottle, as if those small acts kept her daughter close. Aaron, once the boy left in the shadows of grief, grew into a man who carried that pain like a constant companion. The silence of unanswered questions shaped him, but it also gave him purpose. In his early 30s, Aaron joined Cold Case Washington, a group of retired officers, journalists, and volunteers who dedicated themselves to reopening unsolved cases. He spent hours in archives, combing through old reports, flipping through faded photographs, and contacting families who still waited for justice. Each time he spoke about why he volunteered, he simply held up a photo of his sister smiling in her fall jacket. To him, every case was a way of keeping her memory alive. For the people of Maple Falls, the vigils kept the scar visible. For Aaron, his work turned grief into action. The town moved forward, but always with a part of itself frozen in October of 2004, and when new funding reached Washington State Police in 2023, the door that had been closed for nearly 20 years was about to open once again. Almost 20 years had passed since Emily Carter vanished, when a new chance for answers appeared. In the spring of 2023, Washington State Police received federal funding dedicated to reopening dormant cold cases. Among the many names listed, Emily's was placed near the top. For the Carter family, it was more than paperwork. It was the first sign of hope in nearly 2 decades. The task was assigned to Detective Sarah Morgan, a seasoned investigator known for her patience and precise methods. She walked into a musty archive room with the weight of a community on her shoulders, carrying a case file that had swollen over time to nearly 400 pages. The paper smelled of age, filled with faded photographs, handwritten notes, and unanswered questions. On the very first page, Emily's high school portrait smiled back at her. A frozen reminder of a life cut short. Sarah carefully reviewed the old evidence, her eyes narrowing at details that had once been overlooked. One item in particular drew her attention: a navy blue fall jacket belonging to Emily, collected near the Safeway lot. The other was even smaller, a Marlboro cigarette, but discarded close to where her belongings had been found. In 2004, the technology available was limited. The cigarette had been logged, but no biological material could be extracted at the time. It was treated as insignificant. 2 decades later, science had changed. Modern forensic testing could now identify DNA from the smallest trace, even a single cell. Sarah signed the order to send the jacket and the cigarette to the State DNA Laboratory in Seattle. She knew these items, once powerless, now carried the potential to unlock the truth. When news of the renewed testing reached Maple Falls, the effect was immediate. At the annual vigil, whispers of hope spread through the crowd. Susan Carter's tired eyes lifted slightly, and Aaron gripped her hand with quiet determination. For years they had lit candles in the dark, with no answers. Now there was a chance that the darkness itself might finally speak. And when the laboratory confirmed that a viable DNA profile had been recovered from that forgotten cigarette, the entire town held its breath, waiting to see where the evidence would lead. At the Seattle DNA Laboratory, the cigarette butt that had sat quietly in an evidence box for nearly 2 decades was placed under modern testing equipment. In 2004, it had been nothing more than a discarded item, impossible to process with the tools available at the time. But now, with advanced touch DNA methods, even the smallest trace of skin cells could be read. Days of careful work turned into weeks, and then the breakthrough arrived. A viable DNA profile was successfully developed from the cigarette. It was a full genetic fingerprint, one that had been invisible for 20 years but was now alive with possibility. The laboratory immediately notified Detective Sarah Morgan, and she understood at once that this was the moment the case had been waiting for. The next step was genetic genealogy, a process that had changed the way cold cases across the country were solved. Scientists began comparing the recovered DNA sequence against vast databases built from people who had submitted their samples for ancestry testing. Piece by piece, the fragments were matched to distant relatives. Family trees began to take shape. On the computer screen, branches connecting, names appearing, and lines narrowing toward a single source. Sarah watched closely as the experts explained the emerging patterns. Somewhere within those branches was the person who had stood in the Safeway lot the night Emily disappeared. The face hidden in the shadows 2 decades earlier was about to be revealed through science. And when the family tree pointed to one rare surname that was tied directly to Maple Falls, the investigation took a turn that stunned everyone involved. As the branches of the genetic family tree stretched wider, one name began to surface with striking clarity: the Dawson line. It was not a common surname in Washington. Only a handful of families carried it, clustered in the Northwest region. That rarity made the discovery stand out like a beacon. Detective Sarah Morgan leaned closer as the experts circled the name on the screen. Each branch narrowed, each connection trimmed away, until one person remained at the center: Michael Dawson. The name struck Sarah with weight. She quickly traced his history and was stunned by what she found. Dawson had not been a stranger to the Carter family. In fact, in 2004, he had lived right next door. He had been only a few steps away, separated by nothing more than a wooden fence. The deeper Sarah dug, the more unsettling the picture became. Archival photographs from candlelight vigils held in 2005 revealed Dawson standing alongside the Carter family. He was captured in frame holding a candle, his face somber as he joined the crowd, searching for Emily. Another image showed him near volunteers during one of the organized searches, his hand resting on a neighbor's shoulder as though offering comfort. The man who appeared to grieve with the community was now the focus of science, pointing directly at him. For years, theories had swirled about strangers, drifters, or hidden predators. Few had ever suspected that the person tied to Emily's disappearance might have been standing quietly in the heart of their neighborhood all along. And when investigators uncovered accounts that Emily herself had once felt uneasy about her neighbor's watchful presence, the pieces began to align in a way that could no longer be ignored. The name Michael Dawson now stood at the center of the investigation, and Detective Sarah Morgan began piecing together his life. In 2004, he had been 26 years old, working as a freelance electrician. His record showed a minor charge of disorderly conduct, nothing that had drawn serious attention at the time. On the surface, he appeared to be just another young man living quietly in Maple Falls. He had shared a fence line with the Carters, exchanged nods across the yard, and even joined the search when Emily vanished. But 2 decades later, Dawson's life looked very different. At 45, he was living in the nearby town of Riverview. He was married to Karen, a schoolteacher, and together they were raising 2 teenage daughters. Neighbors described him as dependable, polite, and always willing to lend a hand. He still worked as an electrician, often helping families with small repairs without asking for much in return. To his community, he was not a suspect or a shadow from the past. He was the model of an ordinary, trustworthy man. Sarah understood the weight of what they were facing. To accuse such a figure without undeniable evidence could risk everything. If Dawson learned that police were circling around him, he could destroy what little evidence remained, or even disappear before justice was served. Every step had to be careful, every move hidden from the public eye. The team decided to treat the operation with absolute secrecy. Only a small circle of trusted investigators were informed. Dawson's name was never spoken outside of closed rooms. Files were kept under strict control. The investigation had to move forward like a shadow, silent and unseen, waiting for the right moment to strike. And as Sarah and her team watched Dawson's carefully built life from a distance, they knew the next challenge would be to find the one piece of proof that could tear down the mask he had worn for 20 years. Detective Sarah Morgan and her small team began to quietly follow Michael Dawson's daily life. Every detail mattered. They watched as he drove his daughter to school each morning, stopping afterward at a local diner for coffee and a muffin. They noted how he carried out electrical jobs across town during the day, then returned home each evening in time for dinner. They saw him walk his dog through the neighborhood, greeting neighbors with a friendly nod, before settling into a calm routine of watching football with his family. To the outside world, Dawson looked like an ordinary man living a quiet and respectable life. But, to Sarah, Each normal detail was a reminder of how carefully he had hidden in plain sight. The challenge was finding a way to secure his DNA without alerting him. Weeks of patient surveillance passed before the opportunity finally arrived. On a Saturday afternoon, Dawson sat in his garage drinking beer. When he finished, he casually tossed the empty can into a trash bag by the roadside. Sarah's heart pounded as she watched from a distance. Once Dawson returned inside, 2 officers, disguised as sanitation workers, collected the bag and secured the can as evidence. The item was rushed to the laboratory, and the results came back swiftly. DNA collected from the rim of the beer can matched perfectly with the DNA taken from the Marlboro cigarette butt left near the Safeway lot in 2004. The connection was absolute. There was no margin for doubt. The same man who lived next door to the Carters and once stood with them at vigils had left his biological trace at the very place where Emily vanished. When Sarah read the confirmation, her hand trembled slightly. The bridge had been built between the past and the present, linking a 2-decade mystery to the man who had lived behind the mask of an ordinary neighbor. And while the science had spoken with undeniable clarity, the next step would demand memories from those who had once lived beside Emily. Memories that might finally reveal the darker truths they had overlooked. With the DNA match tying Michael Dawson directly to the scene, Detective Sarah Morgan turned to the people who had once lived around the Carters. Their memories, even after 2 decades, could help build a fuller picture of what really happened. One of the first was Mrs. Helen Johnson, who had lived across the street. Her hands shook as she studied an old photograph of Dawson from 2004. Slowly, she admitted that Emily had once confided in her. Emily had said that the young man next door often stared at her through the fence. At the time, Mrs. Johnson had brushed it off as harmless. But now, looking back, her voice trembled with regret. She whispered that she never imagined it could have been something more serious. At the diner, one of Emily's former co-workers was tracked down. She too was older now, her hair streaked with gray. When Sarah asked about Emily's last shift, the woman's eyes filled with tears. She remembered clearly that during break, Emily had leaned close and said the neighbor made her uncomfortable. She had even urged Emily to tell her mother or the police. But Emily had shaken her head and said she did not want to cause trouble. That simple memory, buried for years, now carried new weight. Sarah also combed through the old case files again, and one note caught her attention. A young officer in 2004 had recorded a statement from a resident who reported seeing Emily with a gray-haired man in the Safeway lot. The description had been vague, and without evidence, it was set aside. But now, with Dawson's DNA confirmed at the scene, and witnesses recalling his unsettling presence, the description aligned perfectly. Piece by piece, the human stories and the scientific proof were beginning to merge. Each detail that once felt isolated, now connected, painting a clearer picture of a neighbor who had appeared kind while hiding something darker. And as Sarah assembled these fragments into a single mosaic, she knew the moment was drawing near, when Dawson would no longer be a quiet suspect in the shadows, but a man who would have to face the truth he had buried for nearly 20 years. With the evidence in place, Detective Sarah Morgan knew it was time to face the Carter family. She arrived at their modest home carrying the weight of nearly 20 years of unanswered questions. Susan Carter, now frail and silver-haired, sat in her living room with Erin by her side. The house was quiet, the air heavy with the memory of Emily. Sarah spoke gently, explaining that DNA had confirmed the man linked to Emily's disappearance. His name was Michael Dawson. The words fell like stones. Susan froze in her chair, her hands trembling in her lap. Her face went pale, her eyes filling with tears that seemed to hold 2 decades of grief all at once. She whispered faintly that Dawson had stood in their yard, offering sympathy, patting her shoulder during the searches, pretending to be part of their pain. The realization that her trusted neighbor could be responsible left her speechless, her sobs breaking the silence. Aaron sat rigid at first, staring at the table before him. His jaw clenched as memories came rushing back. He remembered Dawson leaning over the fence when he was a boy, speaking kindly, even bringing sandwiches to search parties. Now those same gestures twisted into a cruel reminder of betrayal. The man who had once told him not to worry had been hiding the truth all along. Aaron's face collapsed as tears spilled down, his voice breaking as he admitted he had grown up in the shadow of this name without even knowing it. Sarah let the room fall silent, giving them space to absorb the reality. She assured them that everything remained confidential, that only a handful of investigators knew the details. The family's privacy had to be protected until the case was strong enough for a legal strike. Susan wiped her eyes, her voice quivering, as she whispered that even after all these years, she would wait as long as needed if it meant her daughter could finally be heard. Aaron gripped her hand tightly, nodding with silent determination. And as Sarah left that evening, she knew the Carter family's strength would soon be tested again. When the time came to finally confront the man who had lived behind a mask of kindness for nearly 20 years, the weeks of silence and shadow finally built toward one decisive morning. It was November of 2023 when the police convoy rolled quietly into Riverview. Thick fog hung low over the neighborhood, muffling the sound of engines and cloaking the flashing blue lights until they reached Dawson Street. Houses remained dark, their residents unaware that history was about to shift. At 5:30 in the morning, the officers surrounded a gray wooden home. Loudspeakers cut through the mist with commanding words. "Michael Dawson, we have a warrant for your arrest in connection with the disappearance and murder of Emily Carter in 2004. Open the door immediately." Inside the house, lights flicked on. Dawson's wife rushed to a window, her face pale with confusion as she looked out at the sea of uniforms. The family dog barked wildly. Dawson appeared on the porch wearing a simple t-shirt, his expression tight, his body frozen between disbelief and dread. He hesitated for a moment, as if weighing whether to resist or surrender. But when the handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists, the mask he had worn for 20 years began to crumble. News spread faster than wildfire. Within hours, headlines shouted across screens and radios. Michael Dawson, former neighbor of the Carter family, arrested in Emily Carter case after nearly 20 years. Maple Falls was stunned. People gathered at the general store, whispering that the man who had once searched alongside them, the man who had carried candles at vigils, was now accused of being the very killer they had feared. The shock cut deep. Mothers who had let Dawson fix wiring in their homes trembled at the thought of what he had been capable of. Neighbors in Riverview struggled to accept that the polite man who walked his dog each night was now led away in handcuffs. The betrayal was unbearable. And as the Carter family collapsed under the weight of hearing his name confirmed, the entire town realized that the true darkness had not come from a stranger in the night, but from a neighbor who had lived among them all along. After his arrest, Michael Dawson was taken to an interrogation room. A cold space with a metal table at its center. He sat with his hands clasped, his eyes fixed downward, refusing to speak for long stretches of time. Detective Sarah Morgan entered with the thick case file in her hands. She placed the DNA results in front of him and waited. Slowly, Dawson lifted his eyes. His face was tense, his breathing shallow. Finally, he broke the silence. He admitted he had been with Emily that night. He claimed it had been nothing more than an accident. He said he had only wanted to talk to her in the Safeway lot. According to him, she panicked, pushed him away, and slipped, hitting the ground. His voice was steady but cold as he insisted. He had not meant to hurt her. He said he only panicked afterward. That fear drove him to hide what had happened. He repeated the word accident again and again, as though speaking it enough times might soften the weight of his confession. But Sarah knew the evidence told a different story. Forensic testing revealed fibers from Emily's navy jacket inside Dawson's car, proof that he had transported her against her will. More damning were the marks found on the preserved fabric and confirmed through modern analysis. They showed clear signs of strangulation, the kind of pressure that lasts for minutes, not seconds. There was no way this could be explained by a fall. Every scientific detail cut through Dawson's account. The accident story unraveled piece by piece under the weight of evidence that refused to bend. Still, Dawson sat with his head low, repeating his claim as if clinging to it was his only shield against the truth. And when Sarah pressed him on what happened to Emily's body, his response revealed a far darker and more deliberate secret than anyone in Maple Falls had ever imagined. When pressed about what had happened after that night, Michael Dawson's voice grew hoarse, and his eyes flickered with unease. At first he tried to circle back to his story of an accident, but under Sarah Morgan's steady questioning, the mask began to slip. Finally, he admitted the truth that everyone in Maple Falls had feared for years. He had not only taken Emily's life, he had gone to great lengths to hide it. Dawson confessed that after strangling Emily in the Safeway lot, he dragged her body into his car and drove to a forest a few miles outside town. There, under the cover of darkness, he dug a shallow grave with shaking hands, laid her in the soil, and covered the spot with fallen leaves and damp earth. He said he thought no one would ever find her, but his fear did not end. Weeks later, when he learned that police dogs were being sent to search the woods, he panicked. He returned to the site, dug her up, and moved her remains elsewhere. The following year, still haunted by the thought of discovery, he disturbed the grave once again. This time he carried her to a more remote spot near an old riverbank, where he buried her for a third time. His voice cracked as he described the endless fear that followed him, admitting that every night he had heard her screams in his mind, yet he chose again and again to conceal the crime rather than face the truth. This was not the picture of a man who had panicked in a single moment. It was the revelation of someone who had calculated and planned, who had buried and reburied a young woman's body not once but 3 times in order to keep his secret hidden. The coldness of his actions sent a shiver through everyone who heard the confession. And as the details spread, the community that once trusted Dawson was forced to confront the horrifying reality that the killer had not only walked among them, but had stood at their side during the very searches for the girl he had buried. By June of 2024, the case of Emily Carter reached the courtroom, and Maple Falls found itself at the center of national attention. Crowds lined the courthouse steps, reporters jostled for space, and cameras flashed as Michael Dawson was led inside in an orange jumpsuit, his face hidden behind lowered eyes. For many in the community, this was the first time they saw the man they once called neighbor, now shackled as an accused killer. Inside the courtroom, the prosecution began its work with the evidence that had cracked the case wide open. Experts explained how the DNA profile developed from the Marlboro cigarette butt in 2004 had been matched with modern methods to the beer can pulled from Dawson's trash in 2023. The scientific connection was absolute, leaving no space for coincidence. Genetic genealogy specialists then testified, showing the jury how family trees had narrowed from thousands of names down to one. The name Dawson, witnesses followed, their voices trembling as they recalled the unease Emily had expressed years before. A neighbor described her complaints of being stared at over the fence. A former co-worker remembered Emily saying that the man next door made her uncomfortable. Each testimony aligned with the science, building a chilling picture of a predator hiding in plain sight. Then came the details of Dawson's own confession. Jurors listened as the prosecutor described how he admitted to strangling Emily, then burying her body in a shallow grave. Forensic pathologists took the stand, explaining that the marks found on her preserved jacket fibers showed prolonged strangulation, not a simple fall. The pattern of repeated reburials proved calculation, not panic. The defense tried to counter. Dawson's attorney argued that Emily's death had been unintended, a tragic accident made worse by poor decisions afterward. They pleaded that Dawson had acted out of fear rather than cruelty. But the prosecution dismantled that claim piece by piece. They pointed to the deliberate concealment that stretched across 2 years, to the forensic evidence that proved controlled force, and to the lies Dawson had told for 2 decades. The courtroom was silent as each fact was laid bare. Jurors watched Dawson closely, but he rarely lifted his head. His silence stood in sharp contrast to the mountain of evidence that spoke louder than any words he might have offered. and when the time came for the verdict, the Carter family braced themselves for the decision that would determine if justice for Emily would finally be written into history. The courtroom was packed to the doors on the day of the verdict. Some stood in the aisles, others pressed against the walls, and many more waited outside, listening through loudspeakers. The tension was heavy, every breath caught as the judge entered and began to speak. His words were steady but firm as he described the cruelty of the crime and the deception that stretched across 2 decades. He reminded the room that Michael Dawson had not only taken the life of a young woman, but had also forced a family and a community to live under a shadow of lies for nearly 20 years. The judge declared that Dawson was guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence was life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The words echoed across the silent courtroom, each one striking with the weight of finality. Dawson sat expressionless, his head bowed, the mask of a helpful neighbor finally stripped away forever. At the front row, Susan Carter collapsed into sobs. She leaned into Aaron, her shoulders shaking violently as years of grief and waiting poured out in tears. Her frail body could barely hold the storm of emotion. But her heart carried the relief that at last the truth had been spoken in a place where it could never be erased. Aaron held her close, his own face streaked with tears. He whispered through his trembling voice that Emily had finally been heard. He said that although they could never bring her back, justice had been carved into stone. For him, the long silence of unanswered questions had ended in a voice that belonged to his sister, carried forward by truth and by law. The murmurs of the crowd swelled into waves of emotion. Some cried openly, others clenched fists in anger at the betrayal of trust, while many simply bowed their heads in heavy relief. For Maple Falls, the verdict was not only the closing of a case, it was the lifting of a 20-year wait. And yet, as the courtroom emptied, the town was left to reckon with the aftershocks of living beside a killer they had once called friend. When the sentence was read and Michael Dawson was taken away in chains, the shockwaves rippled far beyond the courthouse. In Maple Falls, the place where Emily had grown up and vanished, the community was left reeling. Neighbors remembered Dawson not as a criminal but as the man who had stood with them at vigils, who had handed out food during search parties, who had spoken words of comfort to the Carters while hiding the darkest truth. The betrayal cut deep, leaving many angry, not only at Dawson but also at themselves for trusting him for so long. In Riverview, where Dawson had built a new life, the reaction was no less painful. Families who had relied on him to fix their wiring or watched him walk his dog through the neighborhood struggled to reconcile the image of a helpful father with the cold fact that he had strangled and buried a young woman. Some refused to believe it, even after the DNA and confession. Others admitted they now looked at every moment they had shared with him as poisoned memories. Debate spread quickly about the role of law enforcement in the early days. Some accused the original investigators of failing to protect Emily, of overlooking warnings and notes that pointed toward Dawson. Others reminded the community that in 2004, forensic technology simply could not do what it can today. Without modern science, the cigarette butt that cracked the case would have remained meaningless. The argument filled church basements, diners, and online forums as the town struggled to balance grief with blame. Meanwhile, national media turned Emily's case into a landmark example of how genetic genealogy could change the future of justice. Major networks ran features on the cigarette butt that solved a 20-year mystery. Newspapers hailed the case as proof that science could give silenced victims their voices back. Across the country, families of missing persons followed the story closely. Some wrote letters to the Carters, others shared on social media that Emily's justice gave them hope their own loved ones might one day be found. But in Maple Falls itself, beneath the headlines and debates, life carried on under a heavy truth. The community had lived beside a killer for nearly 2 decades. And that realization would never truly fade. And as October 12th approached once again, the people of Maple Falls prepared for a vigil unlike any they had ever held before. A week after the verdict, Maple Falls gathered once more in Central Park. Beneath the familiar war memorial where countless vigils had been held for Emily over the years, But this time, the atmosphere was different. The town was not holding candles in uncertainty, they were holding them in recognition that after 2 decades of fear and silence, the truth had finally been spoken aloud. Hundreds came together, more than ever before. Elderly residents who had joined the first search parties stood beside teenagers who had only grown up hearing Emily's story. Parents brought their children, wanting them to see not just the pain, but also the perseverance of a community that refused to forget. A sea of flickering light filled the park, candles held high against the cool night air. As voices trembled in prayer and silence carried its own weight, Susan Carter sat quietly near the steps, her silver hair blowing in the wind. Her frail hands trembled as she held a candle, her eyes fixed on the flames. She whispered softly that justice had come, but her daughter would never walk back through the front door. Her words made those around her weep, a reminder that verdicts could deliver truth but never undo loss. For Susan, the ache of absence would remain as long as she lived. Aaron stepped forward to speak, his voice strong, though thick with emotion. He thanked the town for standing with his family through 20 painful years. He said Emily's story was no longer just about tragedy, but about a community that refused to let her be forgotten. He pledged to continue working with Cold Case Washington, to fight for other families who still lived in the dark, waiting for justice to knock on their doors. As his words echoed across the park, hundreds of candles rose in unison, a brilliant glow that lit the night sky. It was not just a tribute to Emily, but a vow that her memory would remain alive in every heart gathered there. And as the flames flickered against the darkness, Maple Falls found a measure of closure, knowing that while Emily could never return, her story had broken the silence and given hope to countless others still waiting for light. The story of Emily Carter is not only about a young woman who vanished on a rainy night in Maple Falls. It also reflects larger truths that reach far beyond one small town. It shows how warnings, no matter how small, must be taken seriously. Emily had voiced her discomfort about the neighbor who watched her, but those words were brushed aside. Many thought it was harmless, just a passing unease. In the end, that silence cost her the chance to be protected. It is a reminder that harm does not always come from strangers in the shadows. Sometimes it comes from familiar faces, from people trusted enough to walk beside us unnoticed. The case also demonstrates the importance of preserving evidence. A single cigarette butt left near a supermarket lot in 2004 seemed insignificant then, but preserved carefully, it became the key that unlocked the entire truth 2 decades later. That small piece of evidence proved that even when cases grow cold, science can breathe life back into them. It also shows the value of investment in forensic technology and funding for cold cases. Without renewed resources in 2023, the Carter family might never have received answers. Federal funding, advanced DNA methods, and genetic genealogy all worked together to deliver a voice to someone silenced for 20 years. For other families across the nation, this case became a symbol that persistence and progress can change the course of history. The takeaway is clear. Justice may be delayed, but it does not have to be denied. Communities must listen when someone speaks about fear or unease. Families must continue to press for truth, even when years pass without answers. And society must continue to advance and support the science that can reach back through time and uncover what once seemed lost forever. Emily Carter's story is painful, but it also carries hope. It proves that even the darkest secrets cannot remain buried forever, and that the light of truth can break through when persistence, courage, and technology come together. The story of Emily Carter ends with justice, but it does not end with peace. For 20 years her family lived with unanswered questions. Her community lived with fear, and her brother grew up in the shadow of silence. Now the truth has been spoken in a courtroom, and the man who once stood beside them in candlelight has been unmasked as the killer who hid in plain sight. Emily will never return, but her name will never be forgotten. Across the United States, there are more than 250,000 unresolved cold cases. Each one is another Emily, another family waiting for answers, another community Living with quiet scars, some of those cases may one day find resolution through persistence, through courage, and through the power of science. But many still sit in darkness, waiting for light. Emily's story leaves us with questions that are bigger than Maple Falls. How many more voices are silenced, waiting for evidence to speak for them? How many more familiar faces are hiding secrets behind ordinary lives? And how many families are sitting tonight with an empty chair at the table, wondering if justice will ever knock on their door? This is the haunting reminder that the truth may sleep, but it does not die. It waits for the moment when someone refuses to forget, and when the smallest piece of evidence finally gives it breath again. Emily's memory will live on in Maple Falls, in vigils, in the work of her brother, and in the lessons her story has carved into the heart of a nation. If you are still watching this story, it means it touched you, and it deserves your like and your subscribe. Please help us complete 5,000 likes on this story, because that is the target my mother set for you, and I know you will help us reach it. It costs nothing, but it means everything. Tell me in the comments from which city you are watching this cold case story, and do not forget to subscribe to Unscripted Tales, where we continue to bring light to stories that time tried to bury.